Uh, well, welcome everybody. Really glad to see everybody's faces and glad to be back together again. Let's see, I realized I wasn't fully visible on the screen. So I'm actually really excited I'm always glad to have the Climate Council meetings, but I just came from a health department meeting where, they're sharing some news about the COVID surge. And of course we have to deal with those immediate concerns, but it is good that the city of Knoxville and the people of this community, we can deal with these acute emergencies, but we also can deal with these big picture issues that take sustained planning and not a knee-jerk response, but a careful, well thought out response. So I'm really glad to be back with all of you today and appreciate your passion for finding ways for us to live, work, and play in a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way. So last time we were together, it was National Bike to Work Month, so thank you to everyone who participated in that. For those of you working from home, it's a short bike ride. But I rode my bike to work a couple times, and now the weather's actually perfect for it. So I hope you and other members of our community can incorporate that as we are able. So we all know that these small steps by each of us will add up and help us reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. We also know that we need to find bigger strategies that will have a wider impact for our city. So thank you to each of you who stands committed to helping us find solutions through analyzing transportation, buildings, energy, and today's topic, waste. These bi-monthly meetings are making a big difference that will benefit generations to come. So with that said, let's get started. I guess we'll start with a roll call. Who's going to conduct our roll call? Brian, will you be doing that for us?
Sure. I mean, if it's okay with you, I think we can jump right in. I think we've got.
I'm just looking at my sheet here. It says do the roll call. I was like, this isn't city council. It's climate council.
That's my fault, getting that information to you, Mayor.
Okay. No, thank you so much.
Great. Let me get the screen going here. Okay. So first on deck, and I'll let Luke do most of the steering here, but first on deck, we got Erin Rush from 3 Cubed.
Hi, everyone. So another brief update. At some point, we will have more feedback to share, and we'll require a little bit more time for sharing what we're learning from the communities. What I do want to say is that this slide always helps us reinforce the need and the message that for equity to be meaningfully integrated into climate action, it really needs to be present in all aspects of climate action planning, from the designing of solutions to public participation and participation in that decision making, to the implementation of the strategies themselves, who is actually doing the work, the monitoring and evaluation of those climate action strategies in action, and then in planning or looking at the outcomes. And we're doing that in advance of that final kind of evaluation as these designed solutions get going and implemented. It's important to think about what it is you're hoping to achieve and to use those outcome metrics in our scoring, in our judgment of the proposed strategies, so we can really identify those that we believe will actually achieve equitable outcomes. So I've highlighted them in different colors so you guys can see where we are in this process. We're finding it a little bit challenging to participate in the designing, not necessarily of the solutions in terms of when they get going into the implementation phase, but really in terms of identifying the solutions themselves. So the next meeting for the Equity Working Group, we hope to really think about the transportation and the walkability proposed strategies, and also those that are in the buildings and energy sector that have been proposed by the technical subcommittees, and think about what might be missing, things that might have been identified through some of our community engagement work and through some of the expertise in the Equity Working Group itself. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to contribute to the identification of some of the solutions that have not yet been proposed. And I know that makes for kind of a messy process in terms of, how do you think about those additional strategies when the bulk of the work has been done by these technical subcommittees. But I think if we really want to make sure that this process is centered in equity, what I'm hearing from the equity working group members is some more meaningful participation in that element of the process. So, and then on the right-hand side, in terms of informing action or policy and decision-making, the work that we're focused on right now is through the engagement of frontline communities with using some of the proposed strategies and the sectors that you all have identified for this phase in terms of transportation, the walkability and bikeability of neighborhoods, and then trying to make sure that we have that feedback on those strategies and their anticipated impacts to share with you all. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do a lot of sharing in advance of the technical subcommittees to help inform that process. But as we all know, engaging with communities can take time, not just in terms of how do you work that during the time of COVID, but also in terms of the development of materials or survey instruments, and then getting them into the field and collecting them back and analyzing the data. So it's a time, I think, issue in terms of making sure that the technical subcommittees have heard from us in advance of their meetings. So I think there might be a little bit of work there to make sure that our work is integrated into this process without it being, it feels a little bit clunky right now, but hopefully it'll start to smooth out the more information we have coming in from the communities. So I'll go to the next slide, please, Luke. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys a brief update on some of that community engagement work. One thing we did, and I'm happy to share this survey if people want to. I wonder if I can even do it, provide a link to it in the chat. I'll work on that later, but is to get that feedback from the community in terms of barriers to transportation or walkability, bikeability issues in their neighborhoods, their experiences with public transportation, with CATS specifically. And then Luke, if you want to go to the next page, or you can just click on it, it should show the back of the survey if you just do the next click.
I think Grace may actually be driving the slides.
Oh, yes, there it is. Thank you, Grace.
I'm hearing there, sorry.
That's okay.
Brian's taken over. Apologies.
That's totally fine. So the back of the survey, so it's just a kind of a front back, and there was an incentive. We did provide a $20 gift card to Kroger for completion of the survey. And the back of the survey really focuses on the walkability and bikeability, and also focuses more on the distance to things, necessities. How long does it take you to walk to a grocery store, to the bank, to the bus stop? And then we also ask a couple, we provide space for this open-ended, what are some of the barriers, the key things that prevent you from walking or biking in your neighborhood? And then we also ask questions about, so we can look at these data by age and race, ethnicity, gender, and zip code. So one of the things that's come out of the survey so far, and we're providing them at different locations so we can access different groups. The majority of the surveys so far come from Vine Middle School. And what's interesting is that an overwhelming majority of caretakers there have said for those kids that are not walking or biking to school, they believe they would if they had shorter or safer routes to school. So I think it's just one of the reasons that we do this type of work and engaging with communities is to get that feedback that can help inform our decision making, especially when you have a large number of people, percentage of people sharing the same experience and need. So that's where we are right now. And we hope to do a similar survey asking questions about experiences with their housing and energy to make sure that we're talking about the next the buildings and energy sector. And I'm not quite sure what we'll do in terms of waste. So I hope to learn a lot today and start to brainstorm with the Equity Working Group how we can engage the community on that particular issue. But JD, do you have anything to add in terms of our Equity Working Group work or not? And if not, then that's all that I have to share today.
I don't have anything to add. You've done a great job representing what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Aaron. Flagged a quick question from Amy Hathaway around how many surveys were distributed and answered.
It's great. So I sent a batch of 20 to Vine Middle School, and they were all completed. And JD has a batch for me to look over next. Centro Hispano has translated surveys, and so I think they're hoping to reach between 25 and 50 people in their group. And then we have UT's Office of Disability Services distributing the survey online to a bunch of students. So those are the 4 groups right now that we have in the field. So far, we have, I think, 25 back. So I hope to get between 75 and 100. Good question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Aaron. Brian, are you ready to take over to help set the table and give a report out on the Transportation Technical Working Group survey and the Energy and Buildings meeting?
Yep. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Aaron. I've got a lot I'm going to kind of plow through, and I apologize for how condensed it is, but this would be an iterative process, and we've got a lot of plates spinning right now. We've got a lot of really good conversations. So hopefully this shows you just a little glimpse at everything that's going on with the process. So the building working group, they met on October 13th. We had 15 participants that were facilitators and our staff. And we led them through similar exercises in discussing the starting point strategies, as well as some general definitions about how expectations about defining high impact, high cost, short-term, long-term, and then any particular sticking points that they might have had. And then we sent them a follow-up survey. So I know that quite a few of you have been participating in these working groups, and that survey is taking folks anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, kind of on average, to complete. So it's a pretty robust questionnaire that folks are giving us input on. And we're now getting to the point where we're starting to follow up on those surveys and just do a little tone check on what we're hearing. And today I've actually got a little visual to kind of show you and get your appetite whet a little bit on how we summarize some of these things moving forward, and kind of give you a peek behind the curtain about where the next steps were. So hopefully this will help illustrate. So we had the follow-up debrief call from the technical survey on the 23rd for the transportation working group. And essentially that process looked like any of the actions that they recommended, anything that had greater than 1 endorsement. So multiple people mentioned it, and we've vaguely bundled these. And that'll make sense in a couple slides whenever I show you an example that rolled up. So anything that had some sort of momentum around it, where everybody was agreeing that this is something that they felt like, on their personal opinion or in their professional experience, that this was the best avenue forward action-wise, we started aggregating those so that we can go and start finding models to talk about what sort of mitigation impact we would be looking at of any sort of scale. And we shared their output and asked them for any feedback, just to make sure that, so if you're on that working group, you got a big slide deck that had, here's the recommended actions, here's how we're presenting it. And we're making sure that if there are any nuance and phrasing that when I was looking through maybe got too muddied, or you felt like steered it in the wrong direction, or you're curious why it wasn't phrased exactly how you phrased it, we're getting that sort of feedback right now. And then that's what we're going to share with the equity working group. So anything that you see today in terms of presentation is obviously not final. This is an iterative process. I did not want to throw this on you in January and say, here's the visual, hope you like it. I want to get your feedback early and make sure that what we're presenting and what we're compiling from January and beyond meet your expectations, and that I understand those fairly well. So just a primer, this is a slide that I pulled from previous presentations, but this is the starting point where we were saying we need a model that essentially allows for some variability, because we're going to be discussing a wide range of impacts, and those could be everything from, you know, a low impact or moderate impact to a high sort of abatement scenario. So these are the visuals that we provided you all, as well as the working groups, kind of a glimpse at how we might communicate without saying this is exactly what we're going to do. And this is a sample that was put together by a graphic designer. So we took survey results from the technical working group, and they self-assigned how quickly they felt like achievement of the actions that they outlined would be reasonably implemented in. And some of that's highly subjective. We had a lot of feedback that folks felt like there were a lot of really short-term aspects to actions that they recommended. You know, if you're talking about increasing for transportation, this is EVs, but you know, in particular, we had a lot about bike ped feedback, where folks felt as though there were some relatively low-cost tools that could be utilized, kind of that tactical urbanism sort of mindset where it's low cost, deploy it, try it. It doesn't have to be a very large engineering process. And so we bundled that sort of feedback. We had them weigh in on expected leaders, and then essentially we weighted everything. So we took the general consensus and then we moved it, kind of that barometer, that arrow pointing to somewhere on the cost or duration sort of expectation. Now, you're probably looking at this and saying, you know, where's the mitigation? We're here, we're discussing mitigation, where is that? So next step for me is taking these identified actions and making sure that we have a correlation to be able to start tracking down how to quantify those. We started off with some studies, we had some assumptions that rolled up, and now we're truing that up based off the working group feedback. And then additionally, we'll fold in any sort of considerations as the equity working group is also giving feedback into the process. So we've got a pause for questions here in a second. I'm sure you've all got some thoughts. I'm happy to go back there. I am going to pivot to talk a little bit about today. You guys have seen this slide multiple months in a row now. These are the baseline surveys. Again, just disclaimer, this is not a final ranking. There's no commitment to specific phrasing, and obviously it's no substitution for in-depth discussions. This is literally just how you and the technical working group prioritize things and helped us come up with speakers and make sure that we had the representatives on the working groups that you all felt like we should have in the room. This is how the rankings shook out. And I realize now that my colors are flipped, so apologies for that. The green should be at the top. A little bit of formatting issue there, but organic collection of high volume locations was by far the most highly considered strategy. And there's actually a little bit of interesting nuance in that we'll get on the next slide. And then encouraging recycling of C&D waste was second. Whenever you get into like the mid-range strategies there, you get into reuse, residential compost collection, and then additional methane capture. The bottom two were pretty widely panned, but generally speaking, composting had a lot of comments, had a lot of feedback. So a lot of the panelists today are kind of talking about small scale and scalable composting. And then we've got Patience Melnick to talk about landfills and Knoxville's waste streams. She's going to talk about the actual numbers going through our waste stream. Whenever we talk about the community, we actually have a lot of commercial clients that are on private waste contracts. There's a lot of other contributors to our waste stream. So whenever we talk about emissions and our emissions inventory, we have to come up with some assumptions from EPA, if you all remember, and we have to model some of those missing pieces of information. So it roughly works out to a little over double the amount of tonnage that we see come through Patience's programs as what we consider a part of our emissions profile. So that's part of a broader scope. And always happy to answer questions there. So how you all ranked it. The two interesting bullets for me that I kind of pinpointed here is on number one, you see that there's a not important. This is probably the only one where we had, of all the sectors, a not important for the top strategy. And without singling anyone out, we did engage with some of the landfill operators around here and asked for their perspectives. And they had some concerns about removing a high volume of organic waste from the waste stream because that's how they generate RNG renewable natural gas that goes into the pipeline for fuel. So that is a part of their economic model in the modern day and age, and something that they take a lot of pride in. So removing that and essentially just sending non-methane emitting trash will actually reduce their output of natural gas. And that's what you're seeing captured there. And then the other, historic preservation was the most commented issue for why a requirement around structures that are older should be deconstructed rather than demolished. And there was a bit of a debate encapsulated in the comments that kind of bore out, and should we even be considering deconstructing historic buildings? What are we recommending there? What's the priority that we're sending? What are the signals that we're sending? So a little bit of a debate in there. That's why those ramped up with the not so important and the only slightly important rankings. That's what was reflected in those comments. So I'm going to pause for Q&A before we go to panels. And Luke, how much time do we have? 5, 10? Did we lose Luke? Any questions from the Climate Council about either the equity working group or the other working group discussions?
Sorry, Brian, I was unmuted. We have about 15 minutes for discussion here.
Great.
Brian, this is Steve. I have a question, but it's about the waste. Are you wanting to push those questions to later, or do you want to focus on the equity and the other stuff?
For the question about the waste, is it about strategies that we'll be discussing? Because if so, I'd say let's wait until after the panels and get to the facilitated discussion. But if it's about how we calculate it, I'm happy to answer that now. Our emissions from waste.
Well, I guess one of the things I may be a little out of tune with the process here, because I must have missed the survey on the waste, but was there any look at taking tree trimmings and other types of waste like that and looking at biochar as a way to actually charring the waste and then putting it back in the soil as a way to do sort of organic carbon sequestration? Was that even brought up or discussed by anybody?
I believe that was recommended during the baseline survey without having it directly in front of me about comments, but biochar, I remember getting mentioned. I just can't remember who mentioned it and to what degree. And in terms of yard waste, let's maybe parking lot that until after patients talks and get into, she'll be able to answer that pretty directly about what they look at and what that waste stream for yard waste collection looks like.
Okay. All right.
That'll be the next segment. If I can bait a question, any strong reactions to this sort of presentation? This sort of summary?
Brian, I would say I just find it a very busy graphic. I can't tell. I don't know exactly what it means.
No, that's fair.
It's just a lot of information. Maybe, this is just how we would report out the goals of this sector.
It wouldn't look exactly like this. I needed a way to kind of put it in direct context for the survey, for the technical working groups to kind of digest. But in terms of the graphics about this kind of sliding scale, we had talked about using things that are a little bit maybe more, they embrace variability a little bit more, knowing that we're going to have a range of potential outcomes. So in that idea of kind of presenting some degree of uncertainty, but also encapsulating people's perceptions or their expectations really about how fast they think that the city should be able to achieve certain goals based on their professional experience. That's what I was.
Yeah, well, I certainly like the idea of introducing variability and also like the duration of the project and also the cost and also a third variable of the impact on emissions, our big goals, because some things that are really popular don't have that big of an impact and other things do, and sometimes the biggest impact are also the most expensive and longest duration, but not always. So I like the idea of variability and showing length of time, so people don't think this is all snap your fingers. Is this the audience, is the general public, or eventually it's the general public?
Yeah, so next step, just by the way that the process is playing out, we likely wouldn't have finished with all the waste debriefing by the January meeting. So we would lay out next steps between, we had talked about having essentially a meeting probably sometime in April around the budget announcement to bring everyone back together and unveil our work plan, as well as some more detailed debriefing of the conversations that developed and how we're using that information and how we're building it in for our community approach. So I just didn't want there to be a big lag in the ability for people to kind of look at it and see where my brain is at in terms of how I might summarize some of these and be completely surprised come March, April, whenever we get that on the calendar. So it would be general public, as well as, we'd probably use it to put into our work plan probably more directly.
Okay.
I have a quick question about the graphic. I was just wondering how the identified actions were organized and like ranked, or if there was a specific order on this graphic.
There's no rhyme or reason there's no priority in that.
Okay.
Anything that had more than one endorsement from the technical working group surveys got listed there. I didn't put it in terms of it got 3 or 4 votes or higher or anything like that. It's just more than one, and they were put in there kind of as is.
I have a few thoughts if I can chime in too. So I like the sliding scales, but it's like they're not defined, so we don't know what short is and what long is, and we don't know what the dollar signs mean. So I like the graphic, but then I don't know what they mean. And then I think the identified actions would be good if they were prioritized in some manner, so that at the top it's what would be the best ones to implement. And then for the expected leaders, I'm kind of confused by that. Like, are these, I just think that's kind of unclear. Like, are those going to be the actual leaders, or is that confirmed somehow? Or are we just kind of asking nicely, here's who we want to lead? And so that's just a little unclear.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. Yeah, on the ranges, those are still being decided. So we had some input from the working group level, which, Amy, you've been in a lot of those calls as well. So we're asking every group to kind of weigh in. So I didn't want to put any numbers down there and seem like we're for sure headed in that direction. But by January, I would assume that we should have a pretty clear indicator about what those ranges as they're defined. So we'll have some year ranges about what would be short, what would be long, as well as some kind of funding parameters that people have offered up. Before I get to the prioritizing identified action, because I think that's a question for you all, but the expected leaders were kind of whenever we polled the working groups, who do you feel like is essential to have at the table if we're really going to have success in achieving any of these outcomes? And these were self-defined, so folks said, here's how I think that we should approach it. Here are the actions, whether that's best practices or personal preferences. We left that up to the individual to decide. And then we said, to achieve that, who do you think has to be at the table? And so these are the people, and these are actually ranked in terms of order. So specifically for EV adoption, the technical working group felt like KUB and TVA, it's not shown here, but it was a tie in votes between those two, have to be at the table to drive that change. And that's an expectation of the group. So happy to clarify or field any questions about that. I do want to circle back to your identified actions, and I haven't put a priority around these because in my mind, equity is not weighed in. I think it would be unfair at this stage to consider putting any sort of priority when we haven't considered any of the equity components of it. Now, on a higher level, if anyone has like a hot take about how they feel like that should be presented, I'm always open, always receptive to it. I'm deferring right now because I want to hear from the equity group about how they might want to present that and how they might want to prioritize it. So that's one of the reasons I haven't put a whole lot of effort into it at this stage. Any other thoughts?
I'm glad that you mentioned equity concerns with ranking it at this stage. That was one of my thoughts. Was when I was looking through the actions. I was like, if equity's not weighed into this, I would think that these are a little out of order, personally. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
I think the other element that I'll add there is that, you know, part of what Erin Rose identified is going to be important to helping us make sense of how to interpret these. But then to the second point about if there's other ideas that the equity working group brings forth to say, hey, can you think about these actions as well? We would want those to be something that we can include in this section also.
Ryan, just a quick point on the back to the funding. I get needing to sort of quantitatively define the dollar signs, but help me understand this private public skew here. What's going on there?
So one of the things that we were asking is who people felt like should be the authority that funds some of these. Like, where's the expectation lie? A lot of this is about expectations. It's about the community's expectations for the city's leadership, as well as do they feel like, and I think you've mentioned this in previous meetings, like there's some things that are gonna rely on forces that are outside of the city's control to drive that change. And this is one example of that. Like, where do people expect the city to take a stronger role in driving this? And I put one slide in here. A lot of these are very much skewed public. And so whenever they were thinking public, they're thinking city. That's really, and we could put maybe delineation between like city or other, if that would help clarify. But that's where people are approaching it from, is do they feel like the city should be bankrolling these sorts of projects, or do they feel like that responsibility lies with another entity, whomever that may be?
Okay, but are you going to have, I mean, I guess I was assuming that as the scale moves left to right, it's a representation of the amount of money, whereas this, it looks like as it moves left to right, it moves from private to public. So how, I guess I'm trying to understand, it's almost as if there's two potentially different scales on this same.
Yeah, I think we could better represent this by having one say how much it costs just in quantity, and another who would pay. And I think we definitely have to delineate public,
right?
Make sure it's not just city. I mean, obviously, the city's going to play a role in it, but some of the biggest dollars may come from other public and or private. But I think measuring it in two separate scales. I know there's a desire to get things on as much information in a simple form as possible. But I think it's better to use more slides if we need to make sure the information is really transparent. Like, we don't even need to put expected leaders on this. Like, I think the identified actions would be the key thing on there. And then however we rank them, just make sure we're really transparent about them. Like, rank them on expected impact on emissions and the timing of that, or equity. I mean, like, as long as we're transparent about it, and we can have different scales on different slides. But yeah, Stephen, I had the same thought when I saw that first scale. I was like, oh, this is middling expensive, but it doesn't really indicate the cost, just who would share the cost, how the cost sharing would be.
Great feedback. And we got a comment from Brian Han. I think it may be helpful to show why they would pay as well, i.e. what is part of the incentive for KUB or TVA to be a part of a program. And I think that's fair as well. So these are slides for digestibility, but anything that we would put out as a the ultimate conclusion to this sort of discussion would have a lot more narrative around it and explaining some of the feedback that we heard and what folks felt like context and nuance needed to be explained as well. So this is all great feedback, and we'll take that and start tweaking it into some of the design as well. If you have any follow-ups on it, feel free to reach out to my team anytime. Again, this is by no means anything final. And I believe, Luke, if you're ready to jump to panels, I think we're set.
Okay, excellent. All right, if you want to turn to the next slide. So our technical panel presentations today are around residential waste and food waste and composting. So Patience Melnick with the City of Knoxville's Office of Solid Waste, as Brian pointed out earlier, was going to give us an overview of waste stream collection and processing in the city. So without further ado, Patience, we can have you kick us off the panel presentations today.
Sure, thank you. So any discussion about how to minimize the greenhouse gases that we produce with our waste program really, of course, has to start with where we are now. So I'm just going to quickly give a waste profile of what we're producing and where it's going and what quantities. Next slide. So on the left, you have our sources. On the right, our destinations. I'm not going to read through every word, but over on the left, the curbside trash and the trash that we're getting from the transfer station, it is going to Meadow Branch Landfill. That's in Athens, Tennessee. It's about 60 miles away. And of course, the organic material, and organic here means, of course, the plant and animal waste. That's the material that when it goes into the landfill, that's what's, of course, producing the methane, also some carbon dioxide, but we're most concerned about the methane because it is such a potent greenhouse gas. Meadow Branch does have an active landfill gas capture system, so it is actively sort of vacuuming out those gases with a series of pipes and tubes, and it is kind of cleaning it up and then putting it back into the natural gas pipeline. It's not producing energy per se, but it goes back into the natural gas pipeline. So there is some beneficial reuse there. Construction and demolition. Currently, there are no businesses that I know of in the area that are doing C&D recycling. So all of that material that we get from the transfer station is now being landfilled into a different type of landfill, a class 3 landfill in Knox County. Our recycling that we're picking up both curbside and at our drop-off centers, which still includes glass at the drop-off centers, that all goes to West Rock. They're here in Knoxville. We're very fortunate that they're here because they're the only one of their size in many, many counties. I think the closest is in Chattanooga. So they're a business and they take that material that we give them, they sort it, they bale it, they sell it. And that program is reducing our carbon dioxide by 16,000 metric tons a year. So that's a great program. Leaf and brush from the curbside is going to Living Earth. There's 3 Knoxville locations. It's turned into mulch and sold locally. Next slide. Just a deeper dive on where our recycling is going. Not going to read through this, but you can see that it's all regional. We're really fortunate here, unlike many communities in the country. Our materials were landlocked. They were not going to China. They're not going, really the furthest they're going is Atlanta. Our glass is going to Atlanta. So we have good, strong markets still, or rather when I say we, I mean West Rock. They're the ones doing the selling. Next slide. Finally, just some numbers and percentages behind those materials that I just ran through. This pie chart is really just capturing our residential waste. So it's not looking at what we're gathering from the transfer station because That's not just residential, and it's not just City of Knoxville. We accept waste there from the whole county and from commercial and industry. So this is just basically curbside plus our recycling centers. Starting in the red, our recycling program is 9% of our stream, which compared to the national average of 25%, there's definitely some room for growth there, some opportunity there to grow that program. Our leaf and brush, however, is a real bright spot in our waste program. The national average is 10%, ours is 37%. We have that excellent, every other week pick up at the curb program. And that's excellent because it is keeping, again, that plant matter out of the landfill. And that's what ultimately would produce those greenhouse gases. Food waste, we have not done a recent audit, but this is based on what the EPA says that the average municipal stream produces. So 20%. Right now, all of that is going to that landfill and is producing those greenhouse gases. So I would say that that's kind of our biggest area of opportunity and possible growth. And then lastly, the yellow is just the remainder of the trash that's also going to that Class 1 landfill. And that's it for me.
Great, thank you. And I just want to note we will have time, for questions for all our panelists at the end. Coming up next, speaking of food waste and composting, Chad Hellwinkle, you are up.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Brian asked me to give a brief introduction to food waste and what other cities are doing. You can do the next slide to start with. So up in the upper left corner, that's the food waste that the pieces of the pie that go actually to landfills. That's the national average. You can see that food waste is the largest pie chunk of landfill waste on the average level nationally. And then taking that one piece of pie, the food waste, go to the other pie there, and that's the different components that make up just the food waste. And you can see there that residential is generally the largest piece of the pie, with restaurants is the blue area there second. And I did a little analysis on from looking at the literature and kind of ballpark numbers and Knoxville's emissions. So if you take like 1 ton of wet food waste, it's generally about 0.02 tons of CO2 emissions from the transportation. And I calculated that to the Athens facility 60 miles away. And then by far the largest chunk is 0.15 tons of CO2 emissions from landfill methane emissions. And that number is taken from, it assumes a fairly well-run landfill with 25% of the methane being captured as they're doing in Athens. But even at that, there's a lot of methane leak. Even at a well-run facility, it still has quite a bit of emissions. So in total, 0.17 tons of CO2 per wet ton of food. So you take Knoxville's population, 188,000, at 3.5 pounds per person per week, and over a year we generate 15,500 tons of food waste a year. And that's equal to about 2,600 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year through that process of transportation and the methane. And I looked it up, and that's equivalent to about 570 typical passenger vehicle years. So it's not nothing. Okay, next slide. And I've researched what other cities have done around the country as far as food waste. A lot of the larger cities, or some of the largest cities, have implemented large-scale facilities where you have one compost facility outside of town, and you collect curbside from all the households, and you ship it out to that one facility. There's some downsides to that, and there's been some notable cost overruns in programs like Denver and Montreal and New York. There is long transportation distance because generally these facilities smell, so you have to have them away from neighbors. And it's a chicken and egg kind of thing because cities really want that facility to exist before they start collecting food waste. And that facility wants food waste collection to exist before they build it, you know. So it's kind of a catch-22, what comes first. But on the positive side, they do collect a high percentage of the food waste and get it out there. Other cities have implemented backyard. They really incentivize backyard scale compost operations. You know, giving bins and lessons and to get people doing it in their backyard. But the downside is low participation rates in those kind of programs. And as a composter myself, I know that the decomposition is really slow. In one household, you're really not getting a whole bunch of material to get the microbes heated up and going. But it is low cost for cities. The third option is what I really advocate for, and I'm a fan of, is community scale, where you have dispersed compost facilities that are small throughout the city, and people can bring their own food waste to dump in here and to mix with leaves or organic matter that the city also collects. They can be, the positive side of these things, they can be really small and pilot scale at first, and then you can scale up. They are within neighborhoods or within the city, so there's little transportation needed. And as a composter myself, these smaller types of systems create great soil amendments for gardens, lots of microbes in them. They also act as community hubs where people, you know, congregate to drop off their food waste, and so you get that community, people meeting each other in the neighborhoods. And they can be managed by a trained team. They can either be managed by volunteers or, you know, possibly AmeriCorps volunteers or something like that. You get them trained in composting. And lastly, it's low tech. It really works on the microbes, on the biology itself. So you don't have to be dependent on a doodad from Malaysia or something to make it work. Okay, next slide. In the region, go over some of the stuff in our region. National Resource Defense Council has launched food matters projects in a lot of cities around us, Nashville and Memphis and Asheville and Atlanta. They just expanded to a lot of them. The first city to have these really looking in depth at food waste issues was Nashville. I think it was 2015 they got it. And they looked at a lot of these different options for collecting waste, even anaerobic digesters. And some of that may happen still, but they're really drilling down into this community scale composting. They're working with this Institute for Local Self-Reliance, who's done a lot of good work in Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York. I think they're based in Minneapolis also. But they have some good systems. There's some pictures there of the systems they have going up in neighborhoods. And then lastly, I have to say, me and some colleagues at the University of Tennessee, we submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation to get to actually plan for pilot facilities in Knoxville. And we have partners of Seed, Botanical Garden, Bridge Refugee Center Services, and Beardsley Farm. We still haven't heard back on that grant, but if it does, it'd be great. But if we don't get it, I would be more than happy to help with other avenues to get it done. And that's it for my slides.
Okay, thank you, Chad. Last but certainly not least, Kat McDearris.
Hi, thank you for having me, everyone. I'm the owner of Green Heron Compost, a local composting company here in Knoxville, and we serve all of Knox County. So you can go to the next slide. So some of the basics of how the business is set up is, well, it's a really new business. So we're kind of in an ongoing learning process, very small operation right now. But the way it's set up is customers can sign up online, and instead of us doing like a weekly pickup for each of them, they schedule pickups. So they can have their compost collected on whatever schedule they pick or on an as-needed basis, so that we're not doing unnecessary transportation and causing more emissions from that. So they get a 5-gallon bucket. They request their pickup. We come pick it up. I have a pickup truck that I use to do all those collections, and we grab their 5-gallon bucket, replace it with a new clean one, and then they collect their food waste in that as well. So what makes this business a little bit different is our focus on local farming and local nutrients within the soil. So we transport all of that organic waste to local farmer partners that we work with. And we've been prioritizing organic farmers or farmers who are hoping to become, certified organic farmers, so that they can use this compost not only to fertilize their soil and have better yield, but it helps the nutrients within the soil be more diverse. I'm sure you've heard that our food doesn't have as much nutrients as it used to, and that's because a lot of farmers are using just major fertilizers, NPK fertilizers, so there's not as much diversity within the nutrients, micronutrients. So what compost does is it adds a lot of micronutrients back into the soil. It helps farmers with retaining moisture in the soil. It helps prevent erosion in their soil. So it's really an amazing amendment for their soils, especially if they're using, no-till practices that we know now are much more beneficial. So you can move on to the next slide. All right, so one of our farmers is pictured here. This is Grant Scaff from Beech Grove Farm. He's one of the partner farmers that we work with. And so since our launch last year, and that's September, so just over a year ago, we've diverted about 25 tons of organic waste. And so that's not just food waste that we're talking about. That's also some yard waste and things like that. Shredded cardboard, shredded paper, all of those things can be composted. So it's not just recycling that through your regular recycling methods, but also being able to use those as carbon content in compost. So right now, we currently have about 75 active customers. We get about a new customer per week, we get about a new customer once a week. I'm not reading this correctly. Once a month. They usually have about one pickup per week. Depends on the family. Single individuals usually go a month. People with families, 5 people or so, will usually have a pickup per week. So this year, and since we've started, our farmer partners have been able to double the average amount of compost, fertilizer compost that they can use. So that really helps save them on costs, especially if they're organic farmers. Organic fertilizers are pretty costly in the market. So really their cost doesn't have to relate to the cost of the fertilizer. It's more just the time to turn a couple compost piles every now and then and have basically an endless supply of fertilizer. You can move to the next slide. So some of our limitations and some of our goals. So we want to find a piece of land where we can kind of scale operations. Right now, we're working primarily with just residential collections, curbside compost collections, a couple businesses, but really no restaurants. We'll do some bigger events. We did Vegan Fest last year, had plans to do a few more events this year, but obviously couldn't do that. But we want to have somewhere to scale operations and have a public drop-off point. We get requests all the time for people to drop off their compost instead of having the pickup service, which we'd love to offer, but we can't right now. We want to grow into other types of services like soil testing and consulting, compost consulting. So if there is a company who wants to compost on their own property, or farmers who want to start composting, want to go organic, we can consult with them and figure out the best methods of composting that will yield the best results for them. And more than anything, we want to educate the public and private entities about zero waste and all the benefits of composting. Obviously, I think composting is really cool. So I want to share all of that knowledge and all of that enthusiasm with other people so that they can appreciate it in the same way. Some of the challenges, aside from just financial challenges of finding a property and being able to afford that, is Having a place that's convenient for people. Currently, there aren't any public drop-off locations in Knoxville. Some people can drop off at Beardsley, but that's about it. That's really the only place I tell people to go to for right now. But we would love to have some sort of public drop-off, even if it's not through our business, just some sort of public drop-off point for compost so that it's accessible for everyone. And then finding land within the right zoning to comply with permitting and restrictions, it's a little bit tricky. The land we figured out would probably have to be out in Knox County or maybe even outside of the county, and so it's not very convenient. I want to save on those transportation costs and reduce emissions by not having to go way out into the country to actually deal with all of this compostable matter. So, and the last challenge or idea that we've come up with is we want to develop some incentives for residents and businesses so that they can compost and understand the value of zero waste initiatives and how they can get there, and incentivize that a little bit beyond that. So next slide. One example that really inspired me was in Seattle. My brother lives in Seattle. I went to visit him last year, and they have a composting system where their compost is picked up once a week, their recycling is picked up once a week, and their landfill garbage is picked up every 2 weeks. So per month, they get 4 compost collections, 4 recyclable collections, and only 2 landfill collections. So that pushes people toward that zero waste initiative a little bit more and really helps them understand their waste. So moving forward, some of our suggestions are just maybe a zero waste tax break or some sort of monetary incentive for businesses and residents who really commit to this zero waste initiative or reducing their waste, and provide public compost drop-off locations, of course, and clarify and reduce residential composting restrictions so individuals can compost on their property. I say within reason in this because, of course, there are so many factors to consider. We have to understand the runoff and moisture systems of if there's a lot of runoff from your compost and then it's going into a local stream or creek, that can cause problems. And so we want to make sure that we're handling all of these restrictions, but we make it very accessible so that individuals can compost in their backyard and they can add nutrients to their soil and help with creating the best products that we can in our local area and invest in kind of future generations of our soils. So, all right, I think you can go to the next slide here. Thank you guys very much. If you have any questions for me, you can feel free to reach out via email or check us out online. So thank you very much.
And Luke, I think we've got maybe like 5 to 8 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So if anybody from the Climate Council has any questions for our panelists.
I do. I was wondering if I could pick up on that thread I asked about earlier for patients, I guess. So it looks like that the yard waste is going to the Living Earth primarily. Is there a contract with them, and sort of what can you help me understand that? And then, are you familiar with what's going on in Lebanon, Tennessee, where they're actually charring their some of their stuff and creating the biochar that then is? I mean, I'm just curious how far the thinking has explored this avenue, because my understanding is that even with the, some of the mulching and everything, that carbon is going to eventually break back down and be released into the atmosphere. And so getting the char into the soil as a soil amendment could actually aid in biological carbon sequestration. So I'm just curious kind of where your thinking is and how far y'all have thought about that.
Honestly, it hasn't really come up in conversation. I am aware of Lebanon's program. We do have a contract with Living Earth. I can't remember the number, which year we're on, but there's, certainly several more years on it. But it's something to consider.
If I can chime in there, patients, oops, my screen just shut off. Hopefully you can still.
We can see you.
We might have just lost her.
Yeah.
Am I back?
We can
Yeah,
hear
you're
you.
back.
but you're-
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, my computer just decided to turn its screen off. But we had that chicken and egg conversation when we put the last patient, did you call it our mulch contract, our living earth contract, and we intentionally made that RFP, the request for proposals, very broad so that other types of organic waste processors could feel welcome to apply. And just to be frank, like Living Earth, we didn't get anything but the type of service that Living Earth provides. So traditional mulching for that yard waste. But that's been part of the conversation where we have with some of these more innovative ways of processing organics. And it's always been that chicken and egg, you know, they want to commit before they have the facility, but we need the facility before we can commit. And so we're always open and trying to explore how do we dip our toe into that without, you know, obviously signing up for something that mutually can't serve the needs of the city.
So not to dominate, I'm just curious. So it sounds like Aaron, y'all are open to, or have been historically open to this, but you've got the chicken and egg. So, but have y'all done research on the sort of benefits and tried to quantify the value add of taking that step towards biochar as opposed to just doing the mulching?
Patience, I saw you click off of mute. So if you want to chime in here, please do.
No, you go ahead.
You're the expert in the space. But yeah, Steve, I think our analysis has been more kind of back of the envelope and talking to some of these providers who have provided us some of that preliminary analysis. What I always say when these folks approach us is that we are willing to share as much data as we have around the type and quantities and the per ton cost that we're paying now. And it's just never gotten to the point where we've had a clear enough articulation of those costs and benefits to be able to really formulate what I'd call a solid proposal.
Patience, I had a question. You said that, you know, the great program we do for leaf and brush pickup, you know, is better because otherwise that would go to gas producing stuff in the landfill, right? But if people just let the leaves lay on the ground of their yard, that's even better, right? I mean, not for their aesthetic sensibilities maybe, but if you just stay and mulch in your own property, is that even is that a lower impact?
Even better?
Yeah, I don't know. It seems.
I mean, I would assume so, just because you don't have that hauling, you know, that transportation. It's all very, very local, but yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. Maybe Brian or Aaron could speak more to it, but I would assume so.
Yeah, decomposition of any organic matter has CO2, or methane release as a part of that process. So even composting to some degree, you know, it's less so than a landfill due to moisture control primarily, but and generally, if you do it in your backyard, no transportation emissions. But there are emissions to consider for any of that. So leaving it in your yard as it breaks down, I mean, there's going to be some release as well. Just like in your backyard composter.
Well, I just remember I tried to compost in my backyard and I never had enough green waste. Like my food to green waste ratios were never right. So that brings me, my next question was for Chad. It looked like from your presentation that you seemed to think that the community-based composting was a good middle ground. That seemed to be from the slides in your presentation, that seemed to be a good way forward. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, like you experience in your backyard, you just don't get a critical mass to get that heat and the microbes going. But at the community scale, you know, you can get enough to get the heat going. You get it up to temperature. You get it up to 130 degrees for a week or so, kill all the bad microbes and then let it cool down. So it does a good job.
And those have been done well in other cities. I can't remember, you cited some, but.
Yeah, Baltimore and DC are two places that have these community scale compost locations going.
And then the communities themselves use the output in their community garden or personal gardens.
Yeah. The vision is that it's made there, and then the neighbors that are bringing their 5-gallon buckets to dump in, they get access to the soil back for their garden, or to the community garden. Yeah.
I just love that as a model of like community engagement. People do like a sense of agency, and I don't know, gardening, it's just, it's good for our sustainability goals, but also has some of those social goals that would be positive too, and equity goals like shared labor, shared tools, shared, some small economies of scale that don't go up to like the bigger ones. I don't know. It seems like a good, something worth exploring.
Yeah, I guess the danger I see is if it is all community run, that you can have inconsistent management of the piles. Was community gardens kind of, in Knoxville, it's like sometimes you get a lot of enthusiasm at first and then things cool down, and then so it's good to have some sort of management, low scale or whatever that's paid, I think, or AmeriCorps or something like that watches over and keeps the energy going.
It's been great discussion. I want to be mindful of time. We're 10 after the hour. We still do have some facilitated discussion to get through. If everyone's okay moving on, we can do that. Nancy did write in the chat, mulching more would be best for leaves, but not everyone has one. And then Amy will also weighed in saying yard waste collection, tree limbs, brush is a different story from leaf collection. So wanted to make sure that feedback was heard, since not everyone may be employing chats today. I think you've seen this slide before around our facilitated discussion ground rules. I just ask everyone to be respectful. We're really looking to have the discussion be limited to GHG mitigation strategies for waste, and other topics will be pinned to the parking lot. And again, we're primarily looking to identify points of leverage for each strategy. So next slide. So again, Brian showed these to you earlier, but these are the baseline MCC rankings for waste. So you can see the top two here are implement food waste reduction and collection programs that capture approximately 80% plus of organic waste from all high volume locations, e.g. restaurants, and implement programs to encourage recycling of a significant percentage of construction and demolition waste. The middle three were promote consumption reduction approaches such as sharing and reuse, develop pathways to offer organics, food, yard waste collection for single family and multifamily residential properties, and expanding capture of methane at local landfills and wastewater treatment plants to generate energy. So just wanted to start by getting some initial reactions from folks. And you all have had I guess this is our third pass at it, and you all are typically very respectful and mindful about jumping in. So I will open up the floor to anyone who has any general reactions, and you can see the prompts off to the left. Are there any specific strategies for which the city is currently well positioned? Specific strategies for which private sector leadership and resources are better suited? I think we've touched on a little bit of that. And what are the points of leverage for each strategy? Existing infrastructure, market awareness, and or community buy-in. Would love to hear anyone's hot takes.
So far, we talked a lot about composting as a solution for food waste reduction. I was wondering if we had any thoughts on food waste recovery programs and the implementation of something in that kind of, maybe even incentivizing businesses or restaurants to work towards food waste recovery programs on their own.
Patience, I see your box lit up. Did you want to respond to that?
Well, just that we're really fortunate that Second Harvest is in our community and does so much food recovery. So I think that's kind of been the thinking there, is they're working with lots of grocery stores and restaurants. Our team recently toured their facility and they're doing fantastic work. So
Allie, I think that's a great thought. I wonder if you would envision that being under the consumption reduction approaches, such as sharing and reuse. Would you? I feel like that might be something that we could unpack there through the working group level. And if you're able to make that meeting, we would love to have you there to talk about that.
Yeah, and we'll share the meeting details at the end of the meeting today. Any other thoughts? Anything that sticks out?
I had a question about the recycling of construction and demolition waste. I mean, we really want to encourage people to redevelop existing properties within the city, blighted properties or empty lots or whatever, but as that can often mean, they demolish a bunch of stuff. And I don't know, we didn't really have a presentation, at least not today, on the, how big of an issue that is as far as greenhouse gases. It doesn't produce methane, I guess, but it's a lot of quantity, a lot of mass, and a lot of transportation costs. So anyhow, what have other cities done? What could we do? Does anybody do? Where are we on that? I mean, is it a big source of greenhouse gas emissions? And if so, what can we do to mitigate that?
I'll let Patience talk about anything specific with C&D kind of collection and dispensation in the county that she may be aware of, just in terms of where most of the emissions lie. In that, it's in cement production generally, which is not something that we break out in our inventory, but on a consumption-based inventory. Cement production will be a part of that, and then dimensional lumber. So when you're stripping it out, you're pulling the lumber out and sending it essentially to be landfilled. That's where most of the emissions are coming from on the C&D waste.
Just to say that, we don't have C&D waste. Well, some probably sneaks in, but we're not supposed to have C&D waste, curbside, but we do take in 2/3 of what we take in at the transfer station is C&D. And Brian's right about which materials would be, emitting that. I don't know a ton about it, except that there was a company that was trying to recycle some C&D, gathering it at, right at the point where it was about to go into the landfill. But they stopped doing it because they couldn't make money on it. So at the end of the day, recycling, unless it's subsidized, of course, it needs to turn a profit to be a business. So they weren't able to make it work.
And we weren't able to, none of our landfill representatives that were savvy in this were able to attend. So unfortunately, we couldn't have them present today. I would be interested from like a development or property sort of standpoint. I don't know if.
Yeah, I could speak to a little bit of the bottom one, require that structures that meet certain requirements designated deconstructed rather than demolished. If the structure is 50 years or older and it's a point of being redeveloped, deconstructing something to recycle it is likely a pretty difficult proposition. With the exception of, and I've seen this a lot and we do it quite often, is the brick, the historic bricks or the hand made bricks that come off all the old buildings. That's about the only item that we see viable to save or reuse. And trust me, I save a lot of things, and it's all behind me in this warehouse here that we never end up reusing. But you know, wood is, you know, just by building code, you can't reuse any old wood. Although we do from time to time, cosmetically, we do reuse a lot of old timbers. But, you know, I visit the C&D landfill fairly regularly, and I see a lot of waste that goes in there that could be somehow recycled, mostly because a lot of it's, you know, mixed metal materials and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know. Requiring a deconstruction versus a demolition would be a pretty difficult proposition, I would think.
Well, plus every time you make redevelopment, you know, add time and money. I mean,
Right.
depending on what you're, you know, then it becomes less feasible for, you know, sort of
Yeah.
smaller scale developers or for, you know, people trying to build affordable housing.
Yeah, especially right now, construction costs are just skyrocketing right now. And to add anything to that to disincentivize the redevelopment of older structures would be really detrimental to the actual structures themselves. They just wouldn't get redeveloped.
Just want to add that we do collect the scrap metal at the transfer station and take that. So that is recycled at PSC Metals. So that at least is taken out.
So I would like, I do have a question because we don't take on, like any larger contractor doesn't go to the transfer station. So all that stuff goes over to Riverside, and there's really no, there's no separating at Riverside. I don't know who manages Riverside, but it's right outside of downtown. Anything and everything goes to Riverside. So I don't know who's taking things to the transfer station, unless you just have like a pickup truck. But all of the dumpsters that you see around town, all of our dumpsters, everything goes to Riverside.
Yeah, I think that's true with the larger contractors. Riverside and Poplar View is further out. That's where the C&D from the transfer station is going. And those, one company owns both of those landfills.
Can I ask
Okay.
kind of a big picture question? You know, we spent a lot of time during the panel presentation, and it seems to be backed up by some of the data that patients presented in terms of residential organics being an area of interest, a potential opportunity when it comes to composting. You know, I'm interested in kind of the relative ranking of these as are shown, and whether, you know, having heard some of the discussion that we heard today, whether people feel like this is still the right ranking, or would we elevate, for example, the pathways to organics a little higher, knowing that there's some good momentum in the community scale model that Chad discussed. I'd love to know other people's thoughts about the relative ranking of these after the presentations today.
I was kind of thinking the same thing, because after today's presentation, you know, we had multiple references about how much larger the residential contribution of the organics is into the waste stream, instead of like restaurants and schools, for example, which I think a lot of us maybe thought was where a lot of the organics was coming from. But so just, I was just thinking the same thing about how I would probably reorder some of these based on today's presentations.
I just want to clarify too that, you know, there's the waste from Knoxville, from within the city limits, and then there's the waste that the city of Knoxville manages, which is really a small subset. I mean, our services are primarily there for the residents. We do have, you know, some commercial waste and some out of city of Knoxville waste, but what we are counting and paying for essentially is primarily residential. So it's not that, I mean, I think you're right, that restaurants are the bigger contributor. It's just what we have control over in our program is that residential waste, just to clarify.
So maybe a good question would be, this is something I've heard, so I'm maybe leading a little bit, but Kat, when you think about opportunities, do you see a lot of opportunities, or how much would you love to have, restaurants or businesses opt into your program? I know that would dramatically increase.
Absolutely. And that's the goal. I mean, having such a small business right now, the goal is rooted in growing and being able to offer this to more people, more places, really expedite the process as much as possible. I want to expand this business as much as possible, but more than anything, I want there to be more responsible waste handling throughout the city. So by whatever means that happens, I'm on board with. If that's handled on government side, on my side, if we're working together, I want to be involved. I want to help as much as possible. But yeah, expanding is definitely the goal, and would be pretty amazing if we could get to the point where majority of restaurants within the city are also composting. Some of the limitations with that are training people within the food industry at restaurants. There's a high turnover rate with servers and people washing dishes and things like that. And so when we did an initial study about what it would take to be able to offer this service to larger restaurants, those sorts of limitations came up of how often do they need their compost picked up? Pretty much every day. Once a week would be pushing it, but every day, every couple days. And what all do we include in that waste? Because we can include cardboard, and that's something we'd like to include because it's a great brown matter that we can add as a carbon content to piles. So the main issue though is really just training individuals within those restaurants to be able to have a compost bin next to their other receptacle so that they can scrape off the right food and put the rest of the food or whatever waste into the other section, or that no cleaning supplies gets in there. So sorting it out, I think it's just on that basic level. There are some limitations as far as education and organizing resources with that, because we don't want to have to use too many resources to go through all of the waste before we give it to a partner farm or start composting it, but we do have to go through everything by hand and make sure, okay, there's no plastic in here, there's no dairy in here, there's no meat in here, no styrofoam and things like that. There are all types of different items that will go into those bins that, shouldn't necessarily be there. And right now on that residential level, we don't have too hard of a time sifting through that stuff because most people have the education they need to know what can and can't be composted. But once you get to bigger and bigger scales with that, it becomes a little bit more difficult to control that.
Thanks, Kat. And how, just on a regular day, or maybe like your busiest day out of the week, like how many gallons or how many 5-gallon buckets, maybe is a better question, that are you getting from your customers right now with your current load?
Anywhere from, some days we have maybe 5 customers request pickups, but it's anywhere from 5 to 25. There can be busier days, but usually about a route of 25 houses would probably be our maximum. And we do those routes twice a week, so Monday, Wednesday, whoever's requested. But obviously with more demand, we're going to be taking that up, growing from there. So we're really trying to grow with the demand, not overgrow, so that we can be more sustainable, especially financially, having such a small business. So, but yeah, anywhere from 5 to 25 probably.
And that's about 1 bucket per?
Yes, one bucket per person. So the 5-gallon buckets. Some of our buckets, we use a lot of recycled buckets. So some of them are like closer to 7 gallons, but they vary in size just a little bit. But about 5 gallons per person or per customer.
Thanks. And so I wanted to create a little bit of a sense of scale there because obviously I think there's a lot of great opportunity in the residential side of composting, especially, Chad's got some great ideas that have my gears turning a little bit, but it wasn't that long ago that Beardsley was doing some collection of compostables from restaurants to generate organic matter for the farm. And we could pick up from Tomato Head back in those days. You could get 2 basically giant rolling toters on any day that you wanted, just off pre-plate greens, just salad fixings and people dumping, lemon wedges from drinks in there. So on any given day, a restaurant that's got a decent salad bar and a decent lunch crowd is going to turn out a tremendous amount of organic waste that's pretty much just getting landfilled right now.
Yeah, big market opportunity for sure. And that's a shame about people wasting the tomato head salad because it's delicious.
It's all pre-plate.
Yeah. Okay, I think on that note, we may want to switch to the next. Salad bars, what are those? Asked Mayor Kincannon. I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, Kat. We just heard from you some of the challenges and barriers to maybe broader market penetration and kind of organic waste collection within restaurants. What are other resource challenges that we need to consider as we're looking at these baseline rankings in their totality? Also hearing what we heard today from the panelists is that in background. Where does the investment need to come from? What time parameters should be considered, again, to help us meet our goals of 80% GHG mitigation by 2050? Also, what are the equity considerations need to be considered? And then who are the critical stakeholders? These are just a few questions that we have around broader challenges and barriers to adopting these strategies. As they're ranked so far, I know we invited discussion around potentially re-ranking them. But this subset as a whole, particularly the top 5 here in orange and blue. Anyone want to kick us off?
I think, the first thing I was thinking of during the presentations, I'm pretty sure someone had mentioned the most recent audit of food waste was kind of outdated, if I'm correct on that. So that might be a challenge if we don't know exactly where to target potential food waste for our community in Knoxville specifically. It might just, be a barrier.
And out of curiosity, who typically performs those audits?
I've been with the city for 3 years, and I have, I think there were audits in the past, Brian, or maybe Aaron, do you know, like many, many years ago? But I think typically a consultant company comes in and does it. But again, if we're just auditing the waste that we're picking up, that's the residential waste. So you'd have to work maybe with a landfill to get a more accurate picture. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so typically when we've done waste audits, in my experience in the past, it's typically been looked at as like a building. So you're like, what's the waste coming out of the city county building, for example? Other communities have hired consultants to do basically a waste characterization analysis of waste on a typical truck. Essentially, they would do some assessment of the type of waste that's going to the landfill. So those are much more costly, and I couldn't tell you that we've ever done one. We currently rely on EPA estimates to project as best we can what that makeup for our waste characteristics would be. But not to say that it's completely off our radar. We've Athens Clarke County just recently had put out an RFP, so we're keeping our eyes on what other people are looking at and how much it's costing them to go through that as well. but that's a great question.
Brian, refresh my memory on these baseline rankings. So this is from the survey that we did a long time ago, right? Like at the beginning. And this was essentially just like our perception of what we thought would be most important. And I think where I kind of, when we revisit these, I have a hard time because I don't know, which of these items is the most, what's going to be the most effective for trying to reduce, trying to get to our goal. So I don't know if you can shed any light on, on that, but that's kind of where I have trouble kind of wrapping my head around these rankings again. Is just like, well, looking at this, sure, we think that's a good idea, but is that actually gonna help us get to our goal? And I apologize if you guys can hear my 4-year-old screaming in the background. He just got home.
I get it. They're upset about the rankings too. It's understandable. Yeah, these are the baselines from the start of the process. So originally we were using these to make sure that based off your priorities. So where do you personally rank these, personally or professionally rank them? And then we were identifying some blind spots potentially so that we could go based off your comments, based off how you ranked them, to make sure that when we were forming working groups that we were able to engage the stakeholders and get the sort of feedback that you would be most interested in. So yeah, it was a really long time ago, and that's why I've tried to emphasize that, don't get hung up on these like in the order that they are. It's a place to just start the discussion and see how you feel about it still. Do you still feel the same way? And I get that that was back in May and June, and you probably don't remember how you felt on that day. You might have had, like your trash missed or something like that, or you might have been going through some summer like composting issues, and you're like, I wish somebody would just deal with this for me. Who knows? But don't feel like this is the final version. I think what I'm hearing today, and to take one more step back before I say that, when it came to mitigation, I think a critical part of the process for me wasn't just force feeding what's the highest mitigation activity. Like what's going to get there's the biggest bang for the buck, but is that what we really value? Because I mean, behind the curtain on my own, my team could sit down and we could sketch out what the potential biggest impact would be, and we could bring that out. But is that going to reflect the values of what our community wants us to see? So that's why I wanted to have a discussion and remove some of those multipliers of mitigation, and let's have an honest discussion about kind of the way that we want to get there. Because I think there's a number of ways that we can get there, and there's a number of priorities that folks are going to want to see in a more immediate term and potentially even a long term. And the midterm stuff is going to, I realize this is a little bit of word salad, but and the midterm is basically going to stay on track anyway. Like there's a lot of wiggle room there, but what do you really want us to see urgency on? That short term, how do we prioritize it, bump that up regardless of mitigation? Some of these are services that may not move the needle a whole lot, but it may mean a lot to the people that are able to engage in those services. And that's the sort of thing that would get lost if we just purely put a mitigation number, because honestly, the numbers would favor increased methane collection and sending things to landfills more so than just coming up with composting programs, unfortunately.
I think going forward, the bottom two rankings are there because, well, the word require, I think, is very off-putting to myself anyway. And I think if you were to replace that word with encourage, I think that would be helpful. And then in regards to the community events item, I think that anybody that holds a large community event wants nothing more than it be zero waste. It's just a bit difficult, and there's an education component involved with that. Our annual fall festival, for the past 4 or 5 years, we hire a company out of Sevier County to come pick up our waste because they recycle everything. And Sevier County actually has, and I'm not sure if they still do, but they did when I started hiring them. I think Sevier County has a pretty decent recycling center there, that the dumpster that we throw our stuff into goes there, and they sort it and recycle everything that we put that way. So just knowing something like that, this guy comes in, drops this container off from Sevier County and takes it back to Sevier County so we can get it recycled. But education, I think, goes a long way.
It's a great thought. We've got a little bit of a chat exchange going on right now where a question was posed, and I'm summarizing it here as best I can, but are there adverse impacts that need to be considered about some of these strategies? For example, adverse impacts of community composting. And then, Allie, you kind of had a comment. Do you mind verbalizing that?
Yeah, sure. So when I was thinking about equity, especially with composting, one of my first thoughts is the accessibility to compost facilities. Just for anybody at this point right now, public compost facilities are kind of sparse in Knoxville. And so I think increasing that would be a great idea, but how do we make that accessible for all residents of Knoxville? And also, how do we place those community compost facilities in a manner that is not disadvantageous to certain populations over other populations? And additionally, just kind of pairing the community compost facilities with community garden facilities could be an interesting idea to explore. I'm not really sure exactly technically how that would work, but I feel that having those two kind of correspond to each other might increase participation or willingness to engage with both of those strategies.
And I think one of the things that Aaron Rose is trying to hit on is accessibility is one part of the discussion. And then the other is, what about immediate impacts of smells? I mean, having done giant windrows before that are, 6 foot high at least, and you turn by hand, can get pretty smelly sometimes when you turn it. So proximity may displease a lot of neighborhoods.
So I'd love to comment on a few of those things. As far as community composting and community gardens, I think it's an awesome idea to pair those together. They really would perfectly go hand in hand because you can see the cycle of creating the waste as your garden grows, and then you put it into the compost, you watch it recycle back into soil amendments that you then put on the soil, and then it turns back into food or plants, whatever. So that's a really cool concept where I think the community can learn a little bit more about the value of composting and actually see it in action. And especially those who are working in community gardens probably have a basic knowledge of composting already, or have tried it or could be taught how to do it pretty easily. As far as limitations with smell and things like that, and I saw in the comments here, pest increases, there are plenty of limitations there. If there is too much methane being produced from a pile, it's probably going to be really smelly. So ways to combat that, and what we tell all of our customers and people who ask is, if you can smell the compost pile and it's smelling bad, it's producing methane and it doesn't have enough brown matter in it. So you have to add more leaves, more wood chips, things like that to really combat that, add the carbon matter. It should smell really earthy when it's decomposing. So as far as smell is considered, if we can handle piles, community piles in the right ways, we really shouldn't have any bad smells or many bad smells. It shouldn't be too strong. It really should kind of smell earthy, like you're turning a pile of dirt, So, and the other limitations with pests, it's common for people to get all sorts of pests in their compost piles. I have a groundhog who visits my compost pile all the time. I've actually named him, but I like him because, he or she, I haven't investigated that at all, but that groundhog does kind of help turn the compost pile a little bit. He aerates that compost for me by eating some of the scraps in there. So he does kind of do me a favor. On the other hand, if you get a whole infestation of rats, that's really hard to get rid of. So pests are kind of a tricky area because some piles will have really bad pests. I've heard of piles having huge infestations of rats or mice, and it's really hard to get rid of them. And with those pests kind of living in that compost pile, they'll be, their waste goes into the pile, which then makes pathogens within it. So then we don't want to use that to grow food because there's rat poop and stuff in there. So it is important to keep pests out. There are plenty of ways to do that. We can have enclosed systems or elevated systems, so it's much harder for the pest to climb up into whatever method, whatever container we're using. And we can actually just enclose it in a container. But yeah, there are plenty of ways to combat that. I do joke that the best way to combat rats and mice is just to have a good cat in your yard, or a neighborhood cat that will come and take care of some of those. But obviously that's not a large scale solution. But at the same time, with proper management, you really shouldn't be getting a ton of pests. So I hope that helps to clarify that a little bit.
It does, and I think some of this discussion will be even more material during our next follow-up meeting at the technical working group level. So thank you for that. We can certainly pin that for further discussion. And again, in the interest of time, I want to make sure we are able to advancing to the next slide, please, Grace or Brian. I think, again, we've talked about some of these already, but looking at a high level, what opportunities do we see in terms of these rankings? Where do we think that we can tap into, again, existing infrastructure, market awareness, community buy-in, how we can leverage existing infrastructure with the solid waste and the like. So would love just to invite a general discussion around where we see points of leverage with these strategies. Again, speaking at a high level.
I'll just say I'm really intrigued by the proposal that Chad mentioned, putting in for the NSF grant. And, certainly, Chad, I hope you'll keep this group posted if you are successful in that grant effort. And then, additionally, any of the research that comes out of it.
And one thing I would go back to really quickly with the City of Lebanon example, if I'm not mistaken, I think they used qualified energy conservation bonds allocated from the federal government to TDEC to be able to make the financing on that particular project work.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think that, and remember, with my understanding with that facility is you have, you had that sort of funding source, then it actually generates electricity as part of the output. And then the biochar itself can actually be sold or mixed with compost, become, the best biochar is the biochar that's been charged with composted material. And then that can be sold as a soil amendment. So you begin to create this sort of virtuous circle where you're taking a waste stream, you're actually generating energy, you're then capturing the char itself, you're then mixing it with compost, and then you're pushing it out as a soil amendment, and you're actually getting carbon locked into the soil as opposed to this. I mean, composting is great. I love it. I do it. I'm all for it. But, you're still cycling the stuff back into the atmosphere. And so what we're trying to do is think about, given that we have an excess of carbon, if we can bind the carbon into the soil, and then it actually makes the soil, having more carbon in the soil, and sort of the analogy is it sort of creates almost like a coral reef in the soil that draws in a lot of microbes and other things like that because it gives them structure. So, I'd certainly like to figure out a way to keep that in the conversation as we look at these, because unfortunately it's not clearly identified. But I think looking at the fact that there's almost 30,000 tons, now I don't know the breakdown between the brush and the limbs versus the leaves, but that's just in the city, if I understand correctly, Patience. And then, this could be a facility that is both a city, county kind of draw in that may be able to actually get the feedstock necessary to support it. So I'm certainly interested in trying to figure out a way to keep that thread going.
I was under the impression that the Lebanon facility is specific to their waste stream, that there's some industry in the area that has a tremendous number of pallets. And so I just wonder if it would be possible with our stream.
You are absolutely correct. There is a pallet component to the waste stream. And I think that's one of the things. Aries is the company, and we've set up a discussion with them already. And so now that I have a little better sense of a little bit of this stuff, I'd like to try to figure out what is the volume of feedstock that has to be in to be able to really make this a going concern. And I think that's a legitimate question. But this is where we want to sort of explore.
We do have the leaf and the brush numbers separated out, so I can give that information to you.
And patient, is the county got their own deal going on limbs and everything? So there's an addition. If you looked at all of Knox County, would that number jump substantially, or is that
that, to my knowledge, I mean, that's all private out there. So I don't think the county per se, county solid waste wouldn't know. They don't provide any services like that to the residents out there.
Got it. Okay.
Are there any of these where we feel the city is uniquely positioned to take the lead on strategy implementation? I can ask the same for the private sector as well. Any thoughts around that?
I feel like I've heard one opportunity that Riverside may be having a fair amount of metal coming through there that's maybe missing some degree of capture among other resources that are passing through there. But it sounds like some of the bigger construction projects may be going through there.
Yeah. Anything on the private sector side that's sticking out to folks in terms of an opportunity?
So I think this goes without saying, see the opportunity of reducing food waste. From my end, I'd love to have all residents of Knox City have access to our services or some sort of residential compost pickup service where it is accessible and affordable for everyone. So I would definitely be willing to lead that charge, of course, and expand as much as possible to get to that point. I think, again, my limitation is just I can't expand without having the finances in line for that. But as we get more customers and as we spread more word, I can grow to whatever point we have customers with. The amount of customers we have is the amount of growth that I can do. But in order to get to the scale of, an 80% reduction from larger or high volume locations like restaurants, that's not something that I can do right away. So that's more of I can lead some of the organization for that, but I can't necessarily go out and do that right now necessarily. So, but I'd love to help lead as far as offering the food and yard waste collection for residential properties.
Great, thank you. And we have just shy of 10 minutes left in the conversation. Want to allow some time for a wrap up, but curious about which of these strategies seem more doable in the short term versus those that appear to be more of a long-term enterprise.
I'd be curious if folks, one of the things that I feel like I'm hearing is that there seems to be a general consensus that folks seem like residential compost. It seems like there's some pretty easy barriers to address there to accelerate that. Obviously, a lot of considerations per some of Aaron Rose's comments about impacts to neighborhoods and how you would want to see that rolled out that need to be fleshed out and discussed, but you're not necessarily relying on some of those economic or market forces of having a vendor with the property on deck that's ready to take high volume and process it. Am I accurate in throwing that out? Do other folks feel like I'm encapsulating some of these comments accurately?
Well, I wonder, sorry.
Go ahead, Amy. Yeah, go ahead.
We've talked a lot about composting, but I think that's because we've got Kat on the call, but we haven't heard much from the landfill side of it or like the recycling side of it. Because I think patients said only like 9% of the household waste stream goes to recycling. That seems like there's room for improvement there. But I feel like we don't have all the elements fully represented on the call.
Sure. Well, that'll be the December call. I mean, similar to every sector, I mean, we'll have a bigger panel of folks. So we've reached out to Waste Management, Waste Connections, and been in discussions with them. There just wasn't anybody available today to join us. And then West Rock committed to be a part of these discussions as well. So December, I think we got it on one of the subsequent
I think that's a really good seg. But point very well taken, Amy, that there will be more to come on the recycling side as well, other landfill diversion. So yes, December 8th from 1 to 3 Eastern, we will have our waste technical working group. As always, MCC members are encouraged to attend, but participation is not required, knowing that you all have very busy schedules.
So again, like Luke said, that's a really great point, Amy. One of the things that we've been able to unpack in this is really getting to some of those action level sticking points, especially when we outlined, a full 2 hours to really just allow ourselves to go into the weeds on those. So I think having those bear out about the waste stream and what the landfill operators are seeing as an actual real world application and what's coming in and off the trucks is going to be a big part of that discussion. Part of the issue may be that we're only one of their businesses, in terms of what patient sees coming through. I think it was about 79,000 tons based off waste per capita estimations, the models that we use. We account for about 190,000 tons in our emissions inventory. And then obviously you got 2/3 of the remaining area population in the county. So they're going to have a much broader perspective about what they're seeing in terms of trends and what's influencing it and commercial sector and those sorts of impacts potentially. And we're approaching at it from a service that we provide to our residents. So any of these concerns, let's bring them to the December meeting. Let's start unpacking those. We'll have the same survey process as we've been doing to continue to vet that. So we'll give these ideas a little bit of time to sink in. If you feel like your perspectives on missing those perspectives is heard, and we'll double down to make sure we can drag them kicking and screaming to that meeting. And hopefully it'll be a fun process for them to enlighten us all. And we can build, but we've got to give these ideas some air. We got to discuss them. And then the next step is really getting some of those community concerns, which I think Aaron Rose is pulling back a curtain on some of those concerns that we're not, the optimism is not really capturing. That's going to be a bigger part of the strategy and how we implement some of these programs. Hang on one second before we break. we'll make sure we get some of these links out. We had a few of you request slides so that you could see it. We'll make sure we get slides. We'll capture the chat, and we will send out any resources from our panelists that they feel like would be helpful for you all in the meantime. Are there any questions before we close? We've got about 4 minutes.
Yeah, I'll play the role of Stan Johnson. What about the community as far as from an equity standpoint? I think a key component of what we're doing is community education, because if they're not aware that, you know, composting is a very great way of helping the environment, you know, they won't have a buy-in. So I think community engagement out in the bucket system, I'm loving the bucket system as far as getting the word out. That's a low-hanging fruit that we can actually, won't take much to really to engage the community and get the community buy-in. I think that's very, very important, especially, like I said, from an equity lens on how we can bring the community involved or get them involved.
I'll just echo JD/Stan's comments that, you know, the equity working group is really helpful, and I appreciate the comments that Aaron Rose and JD and others have made today. And one of the strands of discussion was what role the city can play versus the private sector versus other branches of the public sector. I think that community engagement piece and supporting the education piece, that's something that's in our wheelhouse, and that's something that we can and should continue to do as we come, because yeah, composting is not widespread. People sometimes only see, oh, that means it's going to smell near my house, or there'll be rats, or it'll be expensive. You know, people don't always see or appreciate or agree with the benefits. So I think that engagement piece and helping make sure that the things that we move forward with on the city are things that the residents want, need, understand, and support. So, and that means all communities. So engagement, we can take the lead on that.
Great. So thank you, Mayor. Thanks everyone today for joining us, and appreciate your participation and your ideas. When we end the call today, one of the things that we've been doing is going ahead and sending you directly to that customer satisfaction survey. They're extremely helpful for us. We dial these meetings based off your feedback and try to make sure that we're meeting your expectations. So you may see that tab pop up in your browser whenever we close the meeting. We'd appreciate it if you just take a couple of minutes and give us some feedback on how the meeting went today. Otherwise, we'll be in touch. Sorry,
one thing is, I think the all Zoom is better than the hybrid. I'd rather be all in person, but the hybrid was